السلام عليك يا حجة الله في أرضه السلام عليك يا عين الله في خلقه السلام عليك يا نور الله الذي يهتدي به المهتدي.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. The last couple of days in our discussion on Mahdawiyyah, we've been looking primarily at this issue of the ghaiba, the occultation of Imam al-Mahdi. And we've looked at some of the we've looked at it as a potential doubt, a potential stumbling block, and I've tried to give a sense of the prophecies that we have regarding the ghaiba, and then we spoke also about some of the reasons why Allah decided that such a ghaiba was part of His plan for divine guidance. And then yesterday we looked at some of the benefits that we're able to derive from the Imam despite his ghaiba, both us in particular, and more importantly, what function the Imam fulfills despite his ghaiba. That's not tied to whether he's present among us or barred from that presence among us. Today and tomorrow, what I'd like to focus on to wrap up our discussion for this series of 5, I want to speak about prophecies. One of the big discussions when we talk about the Mahdi, when we talk about the Messiah and Messianism, end times, eschatology, when we talk about all of this, there are always mention of many prophecies of what will occur leading up to those end times, or what will happen during those end times themselves, and how will everything come to an end. And in Islamic literature, in the ahadith, we have a plethora of these kinds of prophecies, descriptions of certain events, descriptions of the state of affairs that will be there in humanity leading up to the advent of the Mahdi, and also during his time in power when he's able to do what he is meant to do. So we'll get to, inshallah, some of those prophecies, and I think more important than the details of those prophecies, which I will share with you to some extent, but more important than the details of those prophecies, I want to answer the question and discuss this idea of what are we to do with those prophecies, right? Just as a way to prepare the ground and keep that question in our mind as we're engaging in today's discussion, these prophecies sometimes give fodder, in fact, oftentimes give fodder to people that they start to think or almost imagine those prophecies coming to light, being fulfilled at every time and in every age. Right? Especially now when we're in the middle of this pandemic, a worldwide sickness, like a kind of a plague, and then people see that there are prophecies of a plague that leads up to the advent of Imam Mahdi, then this becomes something that people identify and say, this is that plague, this plague is that plague, right? And the same thing with other events, rises and falls of certain kings, the presence or the absence of certain diseases in society, not the physical disease, but moral diseases in society, certain attitudes that change. So all these different things that are mentioned in the ahadith then fuel this sort of constant messianism. And sometimes it's positive, and oftentimes it's a negative outcome in our community. And so I want to discuss a little bit about the prophecies, but more importantly, as I mentioned, what should we do with those prophecies? How should we react to those prophecies, and how should we engage with those prophecies? So that, inshallah, we'll spend some time tomorrow discussing. Leading up to that discussion, what I'd like to do is focus on some verses of the Quran. There are in particular 4 verses of the Quran that show up in numerous ahadith. They are alluded to in ahadith and also in du'as and in ziyarat. And they are clearly referring to the end times and what will happen, what promises Allah is making, how things will end up for the righteous, for the evil, and so forth. And so I want to spend some time today and tomorrow looking at these 4 verses. Today we'll spend our time with one of them, which is probably the most involved, and I think it will, we'll suffice ourselves with this discussion. It should take the entire time that we have allotted for our discussion. And I'm hoping that this kind of grounding ourselves in these verses will then be a very good stepping stone to addressing the question that I mentioned earlier, which we'll actually discuss tomorrow, which is those prophecies that come in ahadith. What should we do with those? So we'll ground ourselves first in the Quran, in which there is no doubt, which is unimpeachable in its wording, in its intent. Ground ourselves in that, and then we can embark on what ahadith tell us about what will happen in the future. The first verse I want to share with you is a verse from Surah An-Nur, chapter 25, and this is verse number 55. Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وعد الله الذين آمنوا منكم وعملوا الصالحات ليستخلفنهم في الأرض كما استخلف الذين من قبلهم وليمكنن لهم دينهم الذي ارتضى لهم وليبدلنهم من بعد خوفهم أمنا يعبدونني لا يشركون بي شيئا ومن كفر بعد ذلك فأولئك هم الفاسقون صدق الله العلي العظيم. So I'll give you a brief translation of the verse, and then I'd like to spend some time looking at the various aspects of the verse to try to understand what exactly it's telling us. Allah says that God has promised those among you who believe and do good. What does He promise them? 3 things. First, لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. He will, right now I'll translate it as He will make them heirs on earth. كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. Just as He made previous people before them, heirs. Number 2, وَلَيُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمُ الَّذِي ارْتَضَى لَهُمْ. He will establish, make firm their religion which He chose for them. And third, He says, وَلَيُبَدِّلَنَّهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ خَوْفِهِمْ أَمْنًا. He will, I won't translate it literally just yet, I'll explain the literal meaning later, but He basically will replace their fear with security and tranquility. Then He says, يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. As a result of the fulfillment of these 3 promises, those people who were promised and now the promise is fulfilled, will worship Me, and they will not associate any sort of partners with Me. And then at the end He says, وَمَنْ كَفَرَ. Any who are ungrateful after the fulfillment of that promise, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Then those people are the corrupt. All right, so let's go through in a little bit more detail now and try to look at this verse. And just as a piece of advice for how to engage with this, I would suggest that you find this verse in the Quran. It's Surah An-Nur, verse number 55. Pull it up on a device And as I'm discussing it, because the whole discussion will be surrounding this verse and the phrases of the verse, then have it open in front of you so you can follow along with me. Right? You'll get a lot more out of it if you can read through it and see the verse in front of you rather than simply listening to what I'm sharing with you. So the first question is, who is this promise made to? Right? It said, wa'ad Allah, Allah is making a promise. To whom is He making this promise? He says, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Right? So it's to a subset of the ones He is speaking to. Right? He doesn't say, I'm speaking to all of you that I'm going to promise you all these three things. He says He's making a promise to those among you, those minkum, who do two important things. One is amanu, that they believe, and secondly, they amilu salihat, they do good. And these are the two cornerstones of Islamic faith, right? To be Muslim, you do these two things. You believe and you do good. And these two things are core. And these two things are key, right? Neither one is sufficient without the other. We use the imagery that we're given in ahadith that our iman, our faith, is the central facet. It's the root of our tree of faith, or the trunk of our tree of faith. It's the asl. We talk about usuluddin. And then the branches, the practices, what we do, the good deeds that we do, are the outcome, the branches of that tree of faith. And so clearly there's a hierarchy between the two. Iman is of primary importance, and amal salih, good action, is the secondary importance, important but of secondary importance. And that's very important, especially in our world nowadays, because in the world that we live in, there's a way of thinking of those who are moral. They want to be moral, they want to do good, but they don't think of morality and doing good as having anything to do with the underpinning of those good actions, which is your faith and what you believe and what you know to be true and what your intention is. And so doing good is something that is idealized as the main priority, and having correct faith, believing in God, doing things for God's sake, doing things in a way that's pleasing to God and according to His guidelines, is at best secondary, but more often it's completely discarded and seen as something that's irrelevant to the goodness of the act. Right? So in the Islamic conception, both are key, but iman, your faith, is actually more key. Right? إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَلِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى. Actions are valued as a factor of the niyyah behind them. And niyyah is not simply a superficial idea that I'm doing this with a good intention, not for instance, hurting you, or not for pride. That's not the extent of niyyah. Niyyah is actually something that's much more vast, that centers around the underpinnings, the belief that goes into the action. Right? The primary niyyah that I have to have for my action to truly be good is that I'm doing it because this is a way for me to get closer to Allah. This is something that's pleasing to Allah. If that's my intention, and to the extent that can be my intention, that action actually becomes truly good. And if there isn't that intention, then the action is the shell of a good deed. Right? It's the shell without the core. Right? In Islamic scholarship, we use these terms of husn fa'ili and husn fi'li. Right? Let's start with fi'li. Husn fi'li is the shell of the deed. You have actions that in and of themselves, when looked at in isolation, are good deeds, but they're the shell of good deeds. They're the pattern of a good deed. But what makes that pattern, that shell, actually have a core of goodness? It's the husn fa'ili, that the doer of that good deed must have faith, must do it for God's sake, must do it in a way that's pleasing to God. That is of primary importance, that husn fa'ili, that the fa'il and the doer of that good deed have goodness within him, that he's a good person and he's becoming good and he's doing it for good. Then the action, the shell, becomes also a truly good deed, not simply the shell of a good deed. So here in the verse, Allah is making the promise to those among you who believe and do good. So he's speaking to us as the audience of the Quran, to the Muslims, but he's not saying that I'm making the promise to all of you. Rather, he's making this promise to a subset of us, those who truly believe, those who truly do good deeds. Right? Because amongst the Muslims, there are those who have weak faith, who have a sickness in their heart. فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٍ. Amongst the Muslims, there are those who are munafiq, who are hypocrites, who are in the ranks of the Muslims, who do live amongst them and do as they do, but whose hearts are empty of faith. And so he's addressing a subset of the Muslims, those who have faith and those who do good. What is the promise that he makes? The first promise is, as I mentioned, لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. He will make them literally khalifas on earth, as he made people before them khalifas. Now let's just explore what this means. What does khalifa mean and what does it mean in this context? Because we use that term khalifa in several different ways, and we want to see which way is intended here, what makes the most sense. So one way that we use khalifa literally means one who comes after another. Right? The word khalf means behind. So if you think of, we talk about khalifa in terms of political or a leadership role, that one leader goes and once he passes away or once he's out of office, then the one who comes after him, following in his footsteps, behind him is his khalifa. And sometimes we translate that as successor or vicegerent or whatever that term is that you want to use for that. But that's one sense of a khalifa. But that term khalifa is also used in the Quran for people who come after another people, without necessarily any connection between them. It's not that you have one people leaving and then appointing or designating another people to stand in their place and replace them. Rather, for instance, one civilization is destroyed and another civilization comes up after them. Right? And so they're also called khala'if or khulafa of the previous people. Sometimes this term khalifa is mixed up with this idea of human beings being the khalifa of Allah, man being the khalifa of Allah. And some people have this idea that when Allah made Adam the khalifa, inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, when he made Adam as a khalifa, he wasn't making Adam particularly as a person or even as a prophet a khalifa, but rather as insofar as he is a human being, he was made a khalifa. And so since he, as Adam and the father of Adam, is a human and the father of all humans is the khalifa, then all human beings are also khalifa of Allah. And so that idea sometimes circulates amongst Muslims, and people have this idea that every human being is a vicegerent of God. More correctly is that when Allah is making prophets khulafa, when he makes Adam a khalifa, and then he mentions that he makes Dawood a khalifa, and then since Sulaiman inherits from Dawood, وَوَرِثَ سُلَيْمَانُ Dawood, then that khilafah also passes to him. So from those three personalities and prophets being made khalifa, we understand that this khilafah is not something that is general, that comes part and parcel with our human creation and human nature, that regardless of whether I have faith or don't have faith, I'm somehow the vicegerent of God. That doesn't make any sense to be a vicegerent of God. For instance, if I don't even believe in God, if I'm not even living a life that's in line with God, how can I be a vicegerent of God? So when he makes them khalifa, he's actually making them khalifa insofar as they are hujjah of Allah. They are divine guides. They are empowered with that wilaya on tashri' and takween, as we discussed yesterday. So all of that just to give you a sense of some of the different meanings of khalifa that are used. So now we want to understand in this verse what is intended when Allah says that he promises the subset of the believers who are believers and who do good, that he will make them khalifas on earth. So it seems like what he is talking about is what he discusses in other verses where he says the following. So this is in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 128. He says, إِنَّ الْأَرْضِ لِلَّهِ, earth belongs to God. يُورِثُهَا مَن يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. He bequeaths that, he gives that earth to whomever he wishes from amongst his creatures, from amongst his servants. And here, because it's speaking in general terms, min ibadihi does not seem to mean his servants, meaning those who serve him in the intentional way, but rather his servants, meaning his creatures. So sometimes he gives it to righteous people, but sometimes he gives it to godless people as well. Right? And that's something that the Quran discusses, that Allah doesn't simply give power or give kind of turn to those who are good. He also gives the turn to those who are evil. And power and civilization and all these things, they circulate from people to people. And there's wisdom behind that. But it's not that if you have power, then automatically that means that God, you're in the favor of God, and he likes what you're doing, or he loves you, that's why he's given it to you. But rather there's a pattern, a policy, a divine policy that he enacts. And so that power circulates from people to people. They have a rise and a fall, and then it passes to another, and they have a rise and a fall. And throughout all of that, there are tests that are being carried out by Allah amongst for these people. So he says that earth belongs to God, and he gives that earth to whomever he wishes from his creatures. وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. But the end, the final victory will be for those who fear God. Right? So even though that pattern of throughout existence, throughout the creation of this world has been that it circulates amongst people, sometimes to the righteous, sometimes to the evil. But in the end, it will go to the righteous, and they will have the last hurrah. In another verse, he says, mentioning a similar concept of this istikhlaf and having people come after others, he says, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لِرُسُلِهِمْ لَنُخْرِجَنَّكُمْ مِنْ أَرْضِنَا أَوْ لَتَعُودُنَّ فِي مِلَّتِنَا. So he mentions, this is in Surah Ibrahim, verses 13 and 14. He says, those who are unbelievers said to their messengers that we will expel you from our land, or you could translate it as unless you return to our religion. فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ رَبُّهُمْ لَنُهْلِكَنَّ الظَّالِمِينَ. At that juncture, Allah revealed to those messengers of His that we will destroy the oppressors. So He gives them the glad tidings that those who have oppressed you and who are now rejecting your call as you call them, they will be destroyed, and then you will be given the chance in that vacuum to then establish truth and establish the movement that you're supposed to establish. وَلَنُسْكِنَنَّكُمُ الْأَرْضَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ. And we will make you live on this land or in this land after them. So once we've destroyed those dhalimeen, we will give the turn to you, O messengers, and then we will give you power and put you in their place, and then let your people be tested with similar circumstances. ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامِي وَخَافَ وَعِيدِ. But this empowerment that will be given to those who fear my station, Allah says, and who fear my threats. Right? Wa'ad and wa'id. Wa'ad is given for positive promises generally, and wa'id is given for threats, promises of some consequence, of punishment, and these kinds of things. Alright, so Allah is mentioning then that He has this sunnah, this pattern that He runs the world on, that people come into power, they rise and have their civilization, and then they decline, and then another comes and either destroys them or simply replaces them. But the ones that replace the previous are khalifas of those previous ones. So He is promising then in this verse that He will replace these righteous people who are believers and doers of good, He will replace, with them He will replace others. Just like in the past, like we just saw in these verses, there were people who were in power, and then Allah gave the turn to His prophets, His messengers, and allowed them to then take their righteous community, the ones who had passed the test and been steadfast in supporting them, allowed them to now replace the previous people who had failed the test, who had been oppressors and wrongdoers and rejectors of the Prophet. He destroys the past people and then gives the turn to the followers of these messengers to now build their civilization, and gives them a turn to live. You might think, well, what about the Bani Israel? Could we use the Bani Israel's example? Because they also, we have the same phrase that's used for them, where Allah talks about how He will bequeath, He'll do irath and bequeath the land of Egypt, or the land of the Levant, right, the greater Syria, the Holy Land, to the Bani Israel. And once He allows them to cross the Red Sea, and He destroys Pharaoh and his whole leadership structure, there's a vacuum left in Egypt, and then Allah gives that land to Musa and to the Bani Israel. So can we use them also as a point of reference, where He says, كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ, as Allah made others before you successors of others. So can we think of the Bani Israel, who were the successors and stood in place of of Pharaoh and his civilization? Once they were destroyed, then the Bani Israel come in place and develop their civilization in place of theirs. So for instance, in one verse in Surah Al-Qasas, we read the following. This is a promise or an expression of the intention that Allah had in Moses' story, what He wants for the people of the Bani Israel, and because of which He gives them all of these gifts. He says, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. We want to show our favor to those who have been oppressed in this land. وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. And we want to make them into leaders, into imams, and we want to make them into inheritors, into heirs that then take over that land and the power and all of those things, and then do with it as they're supposed to do with it in the servitude of God. And then He continues in the next verse, وَنُمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And we want to establish them in this land. Right? Some of the same words that we see in Surah An-Nur are used here. وَلَا يُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمُ. Sorry, that's right. وَلَا يُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمُ الَّذِي. So yumakkinanna, which is to establish, is used there as well, and it's also used here. So some people amongst the commentators have thought that we can use the Bani Israel also as a model for how Allah made one civilization fall and then replaced them with the Bani Israel. So maybe this is what Allah is promising. I'll do this again for you. وَنُمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنُرِيَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا مِنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَحْذَرُونَ. And we want to establish them on this land, or in this land, and we want to show Pharaoh and Haman and their armies from the Bani Israel what they were afraid of, what they were wary of. The problem with thinking about this is an important point to contrast the Bani Israel in Moses' time with these other civilizations, these other followers of prophets. Right? Think of Ad and Thamud, the prophets that were sent to them, Hud to Ad, and Thamud, Salih was sent to Thamud, Shu'aib was sent to Madian, Lut was sent to Sodom and Gomorrah. So we have these individual. Nuh was sent to his people in probably modern day Kufa. So we have these prophets who were sent to these people. After preaching for lengthy amounts of time, the people, very few of them answered. Sometimes almost none of them answered. The ones who refused, despite sufficient guidance that was given to them, they are destroyed. The ones who survive, the ones whom Allah saves from that destruction, they're always the purest of the pure. Not only the messenger himself is saved, but also the followers who have really been through the ringer in all of those trials that they were subjected to. And they have proven themselves over and over again that they are strong in their faith. And I think of Nuh alayhi salam, after this 950 years as a prophet, right, we're told in a hadith that the only people who came on the ark with him were 8 people, or at most 80 people. Right? So 8 people, if you imagine, and amongst those even one of his sons did not come. Even he was not allowed, even his wife was not allowed, because they were evil and they had refused to believe in their own father and their own husband. Right? And so the ones who are left, the ones who came onto the ark with Noah, were the purest of the pure. They were righteous people who had been tested repeatedly by Allah, and Allah had faith in them, and they were not people who would be corrupted in their own within their own lifetime. This is different from the Bani Israel. Right? The Bani Israel, when they are saved from Pharaoh and saved from Egypt, right, look at what comes out. Who is saved, right? The ones who are saved are all Bani Israel. They are the ones who believe in Musa and believe in his message, but the quality of that community is still very weak. It's still the faith in them is still very dilute. We have still amongst them people who are very weak in faith, right? As soon as they are saved from Pharaoh and Pharaoh is crushed in the sea, what is the first thing that they do? They come upon a civilization that have elaborate idols and they have elaborate practices, and their request to Musa after seeing all of those miracles is ij'al lana ilahan kama lahum aliha. Right? Make us an idol too, like these guys have idols. Right? That kind of attitude still was there amongst them, despite the fact that they had been saved. The same people, some short while later, at the base of this mountain that Musa goes up with those 70 people to receive the revelation, those same people defy the successor Harun that's left behind to mind them. They defy him, threaten him with death, and then listen to a Samiri who comes up with this idea that I'm going to make this golden calf and then we're going to worship this because this is actually the God of Moses. Right? So that kind of weakness of faith, corruption, outright kufr and shirk is still there in the Bani Israel after they are saved. And that's very different from these other saved people who come out of the punishment along with their messenger. And those people were righteous, those people were excellent people. Right? So when Allah is promising these believers and righteous people that He will replace them, or let's say He'll place them in place of others as He did the same thing in the past, for this to be a promise that's a hopeful promise, a promise of something excellent and good, He's definitely talking about the people before, like the people who came out of the punishment with Noah and with Hud and with Salih and with Shu'aib and with Lut. Right? Those people who came out of those punishments were truly righteous and excellent people, and that is a promise that we can look forward to. That we will also, if we can qualify and be the mu'mineen and the amiluna salihat, that we will then be able to be made into the successors of the civilizations that exist as pure followers of God and His religion, right? Not a corrupt society where there's still kufr and there's still nifaq and there's still evil going on, but rather a purified society of truly righteous people. The second promise that He makes is وَلَيُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمُ الَّذِي ارْتَضَى لَهُمْ. He will establish their religion which He chose for them. So this idea of tamkeen, لَيُمَكِّنَنَّ. Tamkeen here, I'll read something. I translated some of the phrases from Al-Mizan, Allama Tabatabai, he explains this term, and he says there are basically two things. So let me read the translation, because there are several elements, I don't want to forget any of them. He says, their religion will be established and practiced in society without any godlessness or inattentiveness. Right? So at that time, Islam, true faith, will be fully established in society. It will be the only religion that's there. People will live it, they will practice it. There will be no atheism and godlessness. There will be no doubts and confusion created for ulterior motives. It'll be a truly a society where there's a true presence of the religion at the deepest level. Secondly, he says his teachings will be accepted by all with no dissent. There will not be any ikhtilaf. Right? So it's not just that we have some Muslims who have good faith, but society is a multicultural, multi-religious society, and I should say multicultural, but multi-religious society where people have all sorts of different kinds of faiths. And for instance, Muslims have the freedom to practice their religion. And now this is the ideal, this is what the promise is. The promise here is that a time will come where Allah will make these people the successors of all previous civilizations, and their religion will be established on earth. And there will be no difference of opinion. There will not be different factions and infighting and religious wars and these kinds of things. One religion will be there. All will submit to it. All will believe in it. All will practice it. This idea of ikhtilaf, just by the way, one of the things that Allama Tabatabai mentions, that this tamkeen of their religion on earth will be absent any ikhtilaf, any dissent. So in the Quranic vocabulary, when Allah describes dissent, when He uses the word ikhtilaf, He never uses it in the way that we sometimes use it. If you think about, for instance, the Prophet ﷺ and his detractors, his enemies, right? From our modern perspective, our secular kind of PC perspective, we might say the Prophet and Abu Jahl, or the Prophet and Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira had a difference of opinion. They both did ikhtilaf. The Prophet disagreed with them and they disagreed with him. And we might put them on the same level and say they both did ikhtilaf, and they both had different ideas with respect to each other. And the same thing you can think about with Muawiyah and Imam Hassan alayhi salam, that they had a difference, that Imam Hassan said one thing, he did ikhtilaf, he had a different opinion to Muawiyah, and Muawiyah had a different opinion, a mukhtalif opinion to Imam Hassan. This is not the way the Quran talks about ikhtilaf. In the Quranic vocabulary, ikhtilaf is only used for the dissenter. The Prophet does not do ikhtilaf. The Prophet holds fast to the truth, to reality. He is not dissenting from anything. He is on the straight path. He is the gold standard. He is the truth. If anyone has a different idea, that person is guilty of ikhtilaf. The Prophet is not on equal footing with his dissenters. His dissenters they're the detractors. They're the ones who are deviant. They're the ones who are off the path of truth. So they're guilty of ikhtilaf. It's not the Prophet who's guilty of ikhtilaf. And you can carry that over to the Imams. So righteousness is not, it's not correct to say, for instance, after the Prophet we have these two factions, these two sects that arise, the Shia and the Sunnah. It's not two factions that arise. It's one faction that arises. Any faction that arises that departs from the path of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, they are guilty of dissent, of ikhtilaf. They have deviated away from the path of guidance. And it's not correct to say that there's a difference, and for instance, truth bifurcated, or Islam bifurcated into these two different groups that are they have different opinions, different approaches to things. So that's just a side note to mention the idea of ikhtilaf. And I think it's a really important idea, and again, because it's different to the way we are accustomed to thinking of things in a secular society. It's important to re-ground ourselves in the way the Quran talks, in the way we should be thinking about truth and untruth. One interesting thing in the verse is that he says, "Dinahum alladhi irtadat lahum." He attributes this deen to these righteous people. And so the commentaries, they say that this is deenul haq, this is the deen of truth, this is the deenullah, Allah's deen that He's taught us, He's revealed to us. Why is He saying this is your religion? So because deen is something valuable, by attributing it to us and saying this deen which is yours, He's actually ennobling us by associating us with the deen. Right? So it's not because He's trying to distance Himself from the deen or say, whatever your deen is. No, this deen that He Himself has chosen for you, but now He's ennobling you by giving you this deen and actually giving you ownership of it and saying, this is now your deen, the one that I've chosen for you. Right? So that's a nice point that Allah mentions about why the word dinahum is used as opposed to, for instance, dinahu or dinallah. The third promise that's made is وَلَا يُبَدِّلَنَّهُم مِّن بَعْدِ خَوْفِهِمْ أَمْنًا. So literally what this says is He will replace them, وَلَا يُبَدِّلَنَّهُم, He will replace them after their fear with tranquility or security. That's a little unusual way of saying it. But what we expect Him to say is He will replace their fear with tranquility. He will replace their fear with security. But instead of saying that, He says, I'm going to replace them after their fear with security. As though He's going to move them out and put security in its place. Now, one grammatical way of justifying it is to say that amnan actually means aminin. That He's going to replace them from that state of fear and replace them with a state in which they are aminin, they feel secure. Right? So He's going to change their state of the fearful state into a state of security. But it seems like maybe something more is being said. Allah has chosen these words, and so we should also think, why would He choose words like this? If you think about how you are in a state of fear, right? The way you are in a state of fear, and this is not fear of some minor occurrence or some minor danger. I think of the kind of fear. You don't have to imagine much nowadays. If you look at the news and see how people live around the world, you see that they have incredible fear for their safety, for their life, for every aspect of their life, whether they'll be able to earn, whether they'll be able to feed themselves, whether they'll be able to live with honor and dignity, practice their religion. There's so much fear that people feel. And now imagine how different you are when you're in a sense of security, when you don't have all those worries. You can focus on the things that you know are important, that you prioritize in your life. You can focus on those things, and you don't have to worry about basic safety of your being in your life. It's as though you're a different person. Right? It's like you're not the same person anymore. So it seems like maybe Allah is indicating that the difference between these people when they're in fear and when they are in security is as though it's a different person. He's actually going to replace those people and replace them with another people who's in safety and security. Now, in reality, He's not replacing the people, He's replacing their state and getting rid of their fear and replacing it with security. But it's as though they're a changed people, a new people. They have a new life now to live because now they're in security where they can pursue loftier goals, fruitful goals, rather than simply struggling to live and survive. So the third promise then is that He's going to replace their state of fear with the state of security. The result of all of this, He says, يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. Now, grammatically, there are two ways that you can think of this sentence. It could be what's called a hal. It's kind of a description of their state, that He gives them that security while they do two things. They worship Me and they don't associate any partners with Me. But it seems like actually this might be, it's better to think of this as the result. It's a new sentence that's just telling what's going to happen now that He's fulfilled these three promises. Right, the three promises are there, He's going to fulfill them. Once it's fulfilled, what are these people going to do with the fact that they have security, the fact that they are now in charge, and they have their civilization is now the civilization that has superseded all other civilization. When their religion is now firmly established, and when they have security, what are they going to do with this? Are they going to, for instance, enjoy themselves and live a life of luxury, or what are they going to do with this newfound situation? So he says that these people, they are believers who do righteousness, and when they're given these situations and the promises are fulfilled, he says they will worship me and not associate any partners with me. He emphasizes the fact that they will worship me and worship me alone. Not a single partner will they ascribe to me. Another interesting aspect of this sentence is that he switches pronouns. If you notice in the beginning, he was speaking about himself in the third person. God promises these people that he will do this and he will do that and he will do this so that يَعْبُدُونَنِي, and they will worship me. All of a sudden he switches from talking about Allah in the third person as him to now saying these people worship me and they will not associate any partners with me. It seems like this is called iltifat. It's a very interesting and a very useful concept to be aware of. In the Quran, Allah oftentimes does this. He'll switch abruptly from using one pronoun to another pronoun. There'll be no transition. And it's sometimes very jarring, especially for people who are not familiar with Arabic and with balagha. When they see this in translation, they feel like it's a mistake, it's very crude, it's very awkward, that all of a sudden he was talking about himself in the third person, he switched to the first person. In English style, this is something that your teachers in school would probably correct and say, you've changed the person here, and this is abrupt and it's uncalled for, you should fix this. But in Arabic literature, and also, even in English literature, it happens, but it happens very purposefully. If it's done well by an artist of words, then they can do it to great advantage. And so the Quran, of course, being a peak of eloquence, does this to great advantage. And so you'll see in various instances where Allah will switch abruptly. Right? He says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, describing himself in the third person. And then all of a sudden he says, Iyaka na'bud. Right? So it's like we were talking about Allah, that He is this and He is that and He is that. All of a sudden we turn directly to Him and we say, you alone do we worship. Right? What is that? What's the reason? What does that do? It draws us in. We were talking about Him in the third person. Our excitement, our interest in talking to this person, this being that we've been describing in these lofty terms, increases so much within us that it crescendos into an address directly to Him, and we turn to Him and say, it's only you that we worship. Right? I can't stand talking about Him and not being present with Him, so now I suddenly am drawn into the conversation, I talk directly to Him. Right? And iltifat happens for different reasons as well. We'll have instances where Allah will, for instance, be talking to people who are kafir and are dhalim and have done all sorts of evil things, and He'll be telling them that they're doing the wrong thing. And then at the end, when He's finally fed up with them, He'll turn to the Prophet and say, وَبَشِّرْهُمْ بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ. I tell those people that they're going to have a painful punishment waiting for them. Right? It's as though he's sick of talking to them. He's been talking to them, warning them, trying to guide them. They're so hard-headed that he sees that there's no use. I don't even want to talk to them anymore. So he addresses the Prophet and tells the Prophet to go and tell them that their punishment is in store for them. So those are two examples of iltifat. There are many others, and there are many other purposes for which iltifat is used. The best interpretive tool that you can use is when you see the iltifat, try to think, what is the purpose? What do I feel differently? What effect does it have on me as the reader that Allah switches suddenly from one person to the other? So in this circumstance, it's very apropos that he switches to the first person and talks about himself, because he's talking about shirk, that they'll worship me alone and they won't do any shirk. Right? Before he was talking about the promise that he has made to them, and now all of a sudden he wants to kind of cut out the middleman, no longer talk in the third person about someone absent, but rather he wants to get into the picture and be the one who is talking directly and saying that they'll worship me. Not that they'll worship him, which reflects or relates to me or refers to me. That's too many. There are too many kind of intermediaries there. It's almost like the pronoun he has become an idol that represents God, and he wants to get rid of that and say, no, they worship me personally, me directly. Right? So it has a very beautiful and powerful effect if you pay attention to it and you see what effect it has on you, and then benefit from that. All right. So this is the end result then of what will happen when these three promises are fulfilled for these people. Finally, he says that there are some people at that point, despite all of these promises being fulfilled, if man kafara here probably doesn't refer to kufr as opposed to iman or Islam. He's not saying that those people who are kafir in that time, then they are fasiq. Because we said that these are righteous people who make it through all of this. The ones who are now empowered and are the ones who are seeing the realization of this promise, they are righteous, devoted believers. Right? For him to then say at the end of that promise of this ideal, beautiful society, to say, and there'll be some kuffar during that time and they are corrupt, that doesn't seem to fit with the promise and the fulfillment of that promise. Rather, what he seems to be saying is that when kafara, those who are ungrateful, right? So kufranun ni'mah is to be ungrateful for a blessing. And that's, kafara can be used in that meaning as well. So man kafara, those who are ungrateful despite all of this, despite the fulfillment of these prophecies and these promises, then those people are truly showing this corruption that they have. So at that point, the corruption will not be a corruption of rebellion against God. All people will be righteous. All people will be worthy of this promise. But even then, you might have people who forget the bounty and forget the bestower of that bounty and show some ingratitude. And if they do, then it's true corruption. And maybe it won't even happen that there are people like that. He's saying this as maybe as a warning for them, that be careful, just because you've been the recipient of this divine promise and you've seen the prophecies of Allah fulfilled, don't take it for granted. Don't feel like you are, for instance, deserving of this. Be grateful that Allah has chosen you and favored you, right? And if you don't, then that will reflect a corruption within you. So it's a warning, not necessarily a prophecy, that there will be people who are ungrateful and who are fasiq and corrupt. Now, so we've looked at the verse. It remains to be seen, what does this verse refer to? Right? When is this promise going to be fulfilled, or has it already been fulfilled? And we see amongst our interpreters that there are a few different opinions. There are some who think that this verse was fulfilled already in the time after Rasulullah's demise. That during the khilafah of the first, what they call Khulafa Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, that was the golden age of Islam, and this verse was fulfilled at that time. The promise was fulfilled during that time. Others think that it happened, with the companions of the Prophet. During that time, it's either referring, you can kind of divide that same idea into two ideas. So it's either that the ones who are being given this promise are the khulafa themselves, or it's the Muslim ummah, right? The Muslim ummah has now been given this religion and been made victorious and this and that, and they imagine that Islam is now superior to all others, and now Muslims are at the top of the food chain and these kinds of things. If you look with any sort of critical eye or detail at the state of Islam after the Prophet died, right, we know that this was not a golden age of Islam. This was a great travesty in the loss of leadership and the departure from the guidance of the Prophet during the time after the Prophet. It was the coup of Saqifa that started this downward spiral that ends in someone like Yazid rising to the successorship of the Prophet, as though he can somehow uphold the ideals of the Prophet. So this was not a golden age, and there's no way that was the fulfillment of this kind of a promise. And Islam is in no better state up until the modern age. Islam and Muslims are not kind of at the top. There's not peace. Even internally, there's so much dissent. There's so much ikhtilaf. People who have differed from the truth and departed from the truth. What we see in ahadith is this verse is referring to a time at the end of time. It refers to the society of supporters of Imam al-Hujjah, Imam al-Mahdi, and it's in his khilafah and his time of rule that these promises will be fulfilled. I'll share one tradition with you from Tafsir al-Ayyashi. in a hadith from Imam Ali ibn al-Hussein Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. أنه قرأ الآية وقال, he recited the same verse from Surah An-Nur and said the following: Hum wallahi shi'atuna ahl al-bayt. These people who are being promised this, they are our Shia, they are our followers, the followers of the Ahl al-Bayt. يفعل ذلك بهم على يدي رجل منا وهو مهدي هذه الأمة. All of this will be brought to pass for them at the hands of a man from us. He will be the Mahdi of this ummah. وهو الذي قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله لو لم يبقى من الدنيا إلا يوم لطول الله ذلك اليوم حتى يأتي رجل من عترتي اسمه اسمي. And he is the one about whom Rasulullah has said that even if it comes to pass that there's not but one day left of this realm, of this dunya, then Allah will elongate that day until a man from my progeny whose name is the same as my name is able to come or to rise. يَمْلَأُ الْأَرْضَ عَدْلًا وَقِسْطًا كَمَا مُلِئَتْ ظُلْمًا وَجَوْرًا. And he will fill the world with justice as it was filled with injustice. And so Imam Zayn al-Abidin helps us to realize what we can realize by reflecting on the verse itself, that this kind of promise is going to occur in a time of in a truly golden age, which is something that has never been seen in humanity. The kind of golden age that is promised, that in which these three things will come to pass, this is something that we have not yet seen at any time in history, and this will only come in the future during the government of Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. I did want to reflect a little bit on two passages from Ahadith, one from Dua al-Iftitah and one from Nahj al-Balagha. So inshallah, tomorrow I'll touch on these as well, because they relate to this particular verse. And then we'll look at the other three verses that also speak of prophecies and things that will happen at the end times. And then we'll talk about that other question of prophecies and what to do with them and how to engage with them. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Help us, Allah, to increase in knowledge and understanding of truth and our commitment to truth, and help us to be a witness to the advent of our Imam amongst his supporters, at the forefront of his supporters, and make us live in this life as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and raise us in the Day of Judgment as followers of the Ahlul Bayt. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Assalamu alayka ya hujjat Allah fi arzih. Assalamu alayka ya ayna Allah fi khalqih. Assalamu alayka ya نور الله الذي يهتدي به